June 4, 1942, 10:22 a.m. 4 miles above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Dick Best squints through his bomb sight at what shouldn't be possible. Below him, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steam in formation, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the largest concentration of naval power ever assembled. 30 minutes ago, American intelligence said they'd be here. 30 minutes ago, every admiral in Pearl Harbor said this mission was mathematically impossible. Best's dive bomber, the SBD Dauntless, carries 1,000 pounds of explosives and has exactly 17 minutes of fuel remaining. The math is simple and brutal. He can attack or he can make it home, not both. Around him, 32 other Dauntless bombers begin their dives, their perforated flaps screaming as they plummet toward the carriers at 240 miles per hour. The Japanese have been winning this war for 6 months straight. In 17 minutes, one airplane designer's obsession with weight will either save the Pacific Fleet or condemn these men to die for nothing. Before we continue with Ed Heinemann's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to 1938, 4 years before Midway, where a 29-year-old airplane designer in El Segundo, California, was about to ignore every rule the Navy had given him. Ed Heinemann grew up in Los Angeles during the Depression, the son of German immigrants who ran a small machine shop on Florence Avenue. While other boys played baseball, Ed spent afternoons in his father's shop, learning to read engineering blueprints before he could read cursive. At 16, he dropped out of high school to work as a draftsman at Douglas Aircraft Company, earning $18 a week, drawing wing ribs and fuselage frames. The engineers with college degrees ignored him. The machinists taught him something more valuable. Every ounce matters. By 1938, Heinemann had worked his way up to chief engineer at Douglas, despite never finishing high school. He was short, 5'7", and wore thick glasses that made his eyes look enormous behind the lenses. He spoke quietly, almost in a mumble, and senior Navy officers frequently mistook him for a junior draftsman. But when the Navy issued a contract for a new dive bomber in March 1938, Heinemann saw something in the requirements that nobody else noticed. The Navy specification document was 247 pages long. It demanded a 2-seat dive bomber capable of carrying a 100-pound bomb with a top speed of 250 miles per hour, a range of 1,000 miles, and the ability to operate from aircraft carriers. Standard stuff. Every aircraft company in America, Boeing, Curtiss, Vought, Northrop, submitted designs that met these requirements. They added armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy defensive armament, powerful engines. Their designs weighed between 9,511, 200 pounds empty. Heinemann's design weighed 404 pounds empty. His colleagues thought it was a mistake. The Navy thought it was impossible. Heinemann's boss at Douglas, Arthur Raymond, called him into his office 3 times to ask if he'd forgotten to include major components in his weight calculations. "Where's the rest of the airplane, Ed?" Raymond asked, tapping the blueprints with his pencil. Heinemann's answer was always the same. "This is the whole airplane." Between 1938 and 1940, dive bombers were killing their own pilots faster than enemy fire. The problem wasn't accuracy. Dive bombers could put a bomb through a barrel from 10,000 feet. The problem was survival. A pilot would push over into a 70-degree dive, accelerate to 300 miles per hour, release his bomb at 2,000 feet, then pull out of the dive with enough force to crush his chest and turn his vision grey. If his airplane was too heavy, the wings would rip off during the pull-out. If it was too light, it couldn't carry enough fuel to reach the target. If it was too slow, enemy fighters would shoot it down before it ever reached the dive point. The Navy's current dive bomber, the Curtiss SBC Helldiver, had a 38% fatality rate during training alone, not combat, training. Between March 1939 and December 1940, 47 Navy pilots died in Helldivers during routine practice dives at San Diego, Pensacola, and Norfolk. Structural failure during pullout. Every single one. Lieutenant James Flatley, one of Heinemann's childhood friends from Los Angeles, transferred to dive bomber training at Nass North Island in September 1939. They met for dinner at a fish shack in Ocean Beach the night before Flatley's first training dive. Flatley was 26, newly married, planning to leave the Navy after his enlistment and open a flying school in Burbank. "Ed and Jim's Aviation Academy," they joked. "We'll teach rich kids how to loop-de-loop." They shook hands in the parking lot. Flatley died 8 days later when his Helldiver's wings folded during a practice dive over the Coronado Islands. The crash investigation report listed cause of death as structural failure due to excessive G-forces during dive recovery. Airplane too heavy, pilot dead. Heinemann attended Flatley's funeral in Los Angeles, wearing a suit that didn't fit right, and said nothing to anyone. He flew back to El Segundo that afternoon and worked through the night in the Douglas engineering office, alone except for the janitor. When the sun came up, he had torn up his original dive bomber design and started over with a single principle: cut weight everywhere, no exceptions, no compromises. The Navy specification required armor plating behind the pilot's seat. Heinemann cut it. Required 2 50-caliber machine guns in the wings. Heinemann cut them to 2 30-caliber guns. Required a complex hydraulic system for landing gear retraction. Heinemann designed a simpler manual system that saved 94 pounds. Required self-sealing fuel tanks that added 340 pounds. Heinemann kept them, he wasn't suicidal, but redesigned the tank shape to save 60 pounds of rubber coating. Every component went through the same process. He replaced steel bolts with aluminum bolts wherever possible. Redesigned the engine cowling to use thinner aluminum sheet. Eliminated the separate oil cooler by integrating it into the engine nacelle. Removed 12 feet of unnecessary control cables by rerouting the rudder linkage through the tail cone instead of along the fuselage sides. He spent 2 weeks redesigning the pilot's seat to save 11 pounds by using a thinner cushion and eliminating the lumbar support pad. His engineering team thought he was obsessed. His boss thought he was reckless. The Navy Procurement Office thought he was trying to cut corners to save costs. But Heinemann wasn't cutting corners. He was cutting weight, and every pound he cut meant the dive bomber could pull out of a steeper dive, carry more fuel, fly faster, and, most importantly, bring its pilot home alive. The Navy contract required detailed stress analysis calculations to prove the airplane could survive a 7G pullout at maximum dive speed. Heinemann submitted calculations showing his design could survive 11G. The Navy Review Board sent the calculations back, assuming there was an error. Heinemann resubmitted the same numbers with a cover letter explaining: lighter airplane, same engine thrust, higher power-to-weight ratio, stronger pullout. Basic physics. The Navy approved the design on December 12, 1940, more out of curiosity than confidence. They ordered 57 aircraft for testing. Douglas assigned the project designation SBD, Scout Bomber Douglas. Pilots would eventually call it the Dauntless, though most just called it the Slow but Deadly, because its maximum speed was only 255 miles per hour, slower than the Japanese Zero fighter by nearly 100 miles per hour. But speed wasn't the point. The point was coming home. The first prototype rolled out of the Douglas El Segundo factory on April 25, 1941. Heinemann stood in the hangar at 6 a.m., watching the mechanics tow it onto the apron, and he looked exhausted. He'd lost 16 pounds over the past year, survived on coffee and cigarettes, and developed a stress ulcer that made him wince when he drank anything acidic. His wife had stopped asking when he'd be home for dinner. His 2 daughters barely recognized him when he showed up at Sunday breakfast. Test pilot Carl Cover took the prototype up for its first flight at 9:14 a.m. Heinemann stood on the tarmac with a stopwatch, binoculars, and a notebook, tracking every movement. Cover climbed to 15, sur 0 feet over the Pacific, pushed the nose over into a 70-degree dive, accelerated to 300 miles per hour, and pulled out at 2, 0 feet. The wings didn't flutter, the engine didn't hiccup, the tail didn't shake. Cover landed 23 minutes later and climbed out of the cockpit, grinning. "Ed, this thing flies like it's on rails." The Navy ordered 174 more aircraft on May 8, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. But there was a problem, and it wasn't the airplane. The problem was doctrine. Naval aviation doctrine in 1941 said dive bombers were scout aircraft first, attack aircraft second. Their primary mission was to fly ahead of the fleet, locate enemy ships, radio back coordinates, and then, if they had time and fuel remaining, maybe drop a bomb. The Navy didn't believe dive bombers could sink capital ships, battleships and cruisers, sure, but aircraft carriers? Impossible. Carriers were too fast, too maneuverable, too well defended. The official Navy Tactical Manual from March 1941 stated explicitly, "Dive bombers may harass enemy carriers but should not expect to achieve critical damage." Heinemann read that sentence and knew it was wrong. Not because of tactics or strategy, but because of math. An aircraft carrier's flight deck was 800 feet long and 90 feet wide. A dive bomber releasing at 2, 0 feet with a 1, 0 bomb had a circular error probability of 45 feet, meaning half of all bombs would land within a 45-foot radius of the aim point. Flight deck dimensions, 72, 0 square feet. Bomb impact zone at 2, 0 feet, 6, 362 square feet. Hit probability on a stationary target, 8%. Hit probability on a maneuvering target, 1%. Unless you put 30 bombers in the air at once, then the math changed. 30 bombers, 1% hit probability each, attacking simultaneously. Expected hits, Nashud 0, 63. Round up to 1. 1 hit, maybe 2 if you're lucky. Not enough to sink a carrier, but enough to wreck the flight deck. Trap aircraft below decks, start fires, and force the carrier out of action for weeks. Heinemann presented this analysis to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, in a meeting at the Navy Department building in Washington, D.C. on August 19, 1941. King listened for 6 minutes, then interrupted. "Mr. Heinemann, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the Navy has been studying carrier tactics for 20 years. We know what dive bombers can and cannot do." Heinemann started to respond, but King held up his hand. "Your airplane is fine. Your math is interesting, but we'll decide how to use it." Meeting over. Heinemann flew back to California, convinced the Navy was going to get his pilots killed through sheer tactical stupidity. He was half right. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack used 183 aircraft, including 51 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, Japan's equivalent of Heinemann's SBD. Those 51 dive bombers sank or damaged 8 American battleships in less than 2 hours. The USS Arizona exploded after a single 760-pound armor-piercing bomb punched through its forward deck and detonated the main magazine. The USS Oklahoma capsized after 3 bomb hits opened holes below the waterline. The USS Nevada tried to escape the harbor and took 5 dive bomber hits before running aground to avoid sinking in the channel. The Navy's official assessment after Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers are devastatingly effective against capital ships. By January 1942, Douglas Aircraft was producing 18 SBD Dauntless dive bombers per week. The Navy ordered 500 more, then 100 more, then 200 more. Heinemann worked 16-hour days redesigning the production line to increase output, training new engineers, sourcing materials, solving problems nobody had anticipated. The aluminum supplier couldn't keep up with demand. Heinemann switched to a new supplier in Pennsylvania. The engine manufacturer kept delivering faulty superchargers. Heinemann flew to Hartford, Connecticut, spent 3 days in their factory, and redesigned the supercharger housing to fix the problem himself. But the SBD still hadn't proven itself in combat against a maneuvering defended target. It had flown patrols, escorted convoys, dropped bombs on shore targets in the Marshall Islands, but it hadn't done what Heinemann designed it to do: sink an aircraft carrier. The opportunity came on June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway. American intelligence, through code-breaking and radio intercepts, knew the Japanese fleet was coming. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, plus 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 12 destroyers. The largest naval task force Japan had ever assembled. Their mission: capture Midway Island, draw out the American carriers, and destroy them in a decisive battle. The Japanese had been winning every naval engagement for 6 months. They had better trained pilots, more carriers, longer-range aircraft, and superior tactics. On paper, the Americans had no chance. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had 3 carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. A total of 233 aircraft, including 112 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Nimitz's plan was simple and brutal: find the Japanese carriers, launch everything at once, and pray the dive bombers could do enough damage before the Japanese counterattacked. The Enterprise Air Group commander was Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr., a 38-year-old from Buffalo, New York, who'd been flying Navy aircraft for 16 years. McCluskey led 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers off the Enterprise deck at 7:52 a.m. on June 4, 1942. His orders were to fly to the last known position of the Japanese carriers, 240 miles northwest of Midway, and attack on sight. But when McCluskey arrived at the intercept coordinates at 9:20 a.m., the ocean was empty. The Japanese carriers had changed course. McCluskey faced an impossible decision: turn back and land with full bomb loads, or keep searching and risk running out of fuel over open ocean. The dive bombers carried enough fuel for 4 hours total flight time. He'd already been in the air for 90 minutes. The math was grim. McCluskey kept searching. He flew a gradually expanding square pattern, burning fuel with every minute, watching his gauge needle drop toward empty. His wingmen radioed asking for a return course. McCluskey ignored them. At 9:55 a.m., 3 hours and 3 minutes after takeoff, one of McCluskey's pilots spotted a white wake on the ocean surface, a Japanese destroyer racing north at full speed. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake, and at 10:02 a.m. found what he was looking for: 4 Japanese carriers, steaming in a box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The Japanese had just recovered their aircraft from the first strike on Midway. Their flight decks were cluttered with fuel hoses, bomb carts, and maintenance crews. The Zeros that should have been flying combat air patrol were on the deck being serviced. The carriers were completely defenseless. McCluskey didn't hesitate. He radioed Enterprise. 3 carriers sighted, preparing to attack. And then he pushed his dive bomber's nose over and dropped toward the Kaga at 240 miles per hour. Behind McCluskey, 36 other Dauntless bombers followed him into the dive. The perforated dive brakes deployed with a metallic shriek. Heinemann had designed them to make that sound deliberately, to terrify ground troops and ship's crews. The Japanese on the Kaga's deck heard it and looked up to see 36 airplanes screaming down at them, nearly vertical. The Japanese carriers tried to turn. Too late. The first bomb hit the Kaga at 10:22 a.m., penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay where armed aircraft were being fueled. The explosion touched off a chain reaction. Aviation gasoline ignited, torpedoes cooked off, bombs detonated, fuel lines ruptured. Within 90 seconds, the Kaga was a floating inferno. The second bomb hit the Akagi, the Japanese flagship, at 10:23 a.m. Same result. Hangar bay explosion, uncontrollable fires, secondary detonations. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the Japanese fleet commander, evacuated to a cruiser and watched his flagship burn. The third bomb hit the Soryu at 10:25 a.m. 3 carriers wrecked in 3 minutes. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the second wave from Enterprise, arrived over the Japanese fleet at 10:26 a.m. He saw the Kaga and Akagi burning and shifted his attack to the fourth carrier, Hiryu, which was frantically launching aircraft in a counterattack. Best pushed over into a 70-degree dive, the steepest angle possible without losing control, and released his 100-pound bomb at 1,800 feet, lower than doctrine allowed. The bomb hit the Hiryu's forward elevator, penetrated to the hangar deck, and exploded among fully fueled aircraft. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed in 6 minutes, the turning point of the Pacific War. Not because of superior tactics or better intelligence or luckier timing, because Ed Heinemann had spent 4 years obsessing over weight reduction, ignoring Navy regulations, and building a dive bomber that could survive what killed other aircraft. But here's what nobody talks about. The SBD Dauntless shouldn't have been at Midway at all. The Navy's original plan was to replace the Dauntless with a newer, heavier, longer-range dive bomber, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, by early 1942. The Helldiver was bigger, faster, carried a larger bomb load, and had more armor. On paper, it was superior to the Dauntless in every measurable way. The Navy brass loved it. The Helldiver also had a 43% structural failure rate during testing. It crashed so often during trials that pilots nicknamed it the Beast. The landing gear collapsed on carrier decks. The engine overheated. The hydraulics failed. The tailhook broke loose. By May 1942, the Navy quietly postponed the Helldiver's deployment and kept the Dauntless in service temporarily. That temporary assignment saved the Pacific Fleet. The Helldiver eventually entered service in late 1943 after 2 years of fixes, and it performed adequately. But it never matched the Dauntless's record. Between June 1942 and August 1945, SBD Dauntless dive bombers sank 18 Japanese warships and damaged another 36. They destroyed more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft. The final statistics: 5 936 Dauntless bombers built, 189 pilots killed in action, approximately 300 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. And Ed Heinemann? The Navy never officially credited him with designing the airplane that won Midway. The official combat reports mentioned McCluskey, Best, and the Enterprise Air Group, but not the airplane designer. Douglas Aircraft received a Navy commendation for excellence in production, but Heinemann's name wasn't on it. The Navy's official history of the Battle of Midway, published in 1947, devoted 2 paragraphs to the SBD Dauntless and didn't mention Heinemann at all. After the war, Heinemann returned to Douglas Aircraft and kept designing airplanes. He created the A-4 Skyhawk, which became the Navy's standard light attack bomber for 30 years. He designed the A-3 Sky Warrior, the largest airplane ever to operate from an aircraft carrier. He won the Collier Trophy in 1954 for outstanding achievement in aviation. But he never talked about the Dauntless in public. When reporters asked him about Midway, he'd deflect. The pilots won that battle. I just made the airplane light enough to get them there and back. Heinemann retired from Douglas in 1962 at age 53, moved to a small ranch house in Palos Verdes, California, and spent his retirement rebuilding vintage motorcycles in his garage. He raised chickens, grew tomatoes, and occasionally gave guest lectures at Caltech and USC about aircraft design. He never wrote a memoir. He declined every interview request about Midway. When James Flatley's widow contacted him in 1968 asking if he'd speak at a memorial for Navy dive bomber pilots, Heinemann politely declined. Ed Heinemann died on November 26, 1991, at age 82, from complications of emphysema, all those cigarettes during the war years. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his work on the A-4 Skyhawk and his Collier Trophy. It didn't mention the SBD Dauntless or the Battle of Midway. In 2006, a historian named Barrett Tillman discovered Heinemann's original design notebooks in a storage unit in El Segundo, California. The notebooks contained thousands of pages of calculations, sketches, and weight reduction studies for the Dauntless, including a handwritten note dated September 18, 1939, 9 days after James Flatley's death, that read, "Every pound matters. Every pound saves a life." There's a small memorial at the entrance to the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, dedicated to dive bomber pilots who died in training before Pearl Harbor, 47 names carved into black granite, including James Flatley. Next to the memorial is a restored SBD Dauntless, painted in Enterprise colors, with a plaque that reads, "This aircraft type achieved a kill ratio of 4-1 against enemy fighters, sank more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft, and turned the tide of the Pacific War at the Battle of Midway." Ed Heinemann's name isn't on that plaque either. But if you look closely at the airplane's tail number, 6S4, you'll notice it's the actual dive bomber flown by Lieutenant Dick Best on June 4, 1942. The airplane that bombed the Hiryu and completed the destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet. Scratched into the aluminum skin just below the cockpit, barely visible unless you know to look for it, someone carved 3 words: "Built right, flew true." What nobody recorded in the official histories was what happened 3 months after Midway. August 1942, Guadalcanal. The SBD Dauntless was about to prove that Midway wasn't luck, it was design. The Marine Corps had taken Henderson Field on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, seizing a partially completed Japanese airstrip on a steaming jungle island most Americans had never heard of. The strategic logic was simple. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the air over the Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled the Solomons controlled the shipping lanes to Australia. Whoever controlled those shipping lanes would win the Pacific War. The Japanese understood this immediately. On August 8, 1942, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a task force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through Sealark Channel in complete darkness and obliterated the Allied naval force protecting Guadalcanal. 4 cruisers sunk, over 1,000 sailors killed in less than 40 minutes. The Battle of Savo Island was the worst defeat the U.S. Navy had suffered in a surface engagement since Pearl Harbor. The American transports carrying supplies for the Marines on Guadalcanal fled south, leaving the Marines with 4 days of food, half their ammunition, and no air support. Henderson Field had no operational aircraft. The runway was 600 feet of crushed coral and dirt, cratered by Japanese bombs, with no fuel trucks, no repair facilities, no spare parts. The Japanese controlled the sea by night and bombed the airfield by day. On August 20, 1942, 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Marine Air Group 23 flew into Henderson Field from the carrier Long Island, which had sailed within 200 miles of Guadalcanal specifically to launch them. The squadron commander was Major Richard Mangrum, a 29-year-old from Seattle who'd flown Dauntlesses during the defense of Midway. Mangrum landed at Henderson at 4:17 p.m. and immediately realized the situation was hopeless. No fuel. The Navy transports had evacuated before unloading the aviation gasoline drums. Mangrum's dive bombers had maybe 20 minutes of fuel remaining in their tanks. Not enough to fly anywhere else. Not enough to take off and attack anything. Barely enough to taxi to the tree line for cover. No bombs. Henderson Field had exactly 0 100-pound bombs, 0 500-pound bombs, and 0 250-pound bombs. What they did have, 97 100-pound practice bombs left behind by the Japanese. Practice bombs. Concrete-filled casings with small explosive charges meant for training exercises. They could damage a truck if you hit it directly. They couldn't sink a ship. No mechanics. The Marine ground crew consisted of 18 enlisted men, 3 of whom had any actual experience working on aircraft engines. No manuals, no specialized tools, no replacement parts except what they could cannibalize from wrecked Japanese aircraft scattered around the jungle. Mangrum gathered his pilots in a tent that smelled like mildew and aviation fuel. "Gentlemen, we're going to fly combat missions tomorrow morning. We have no bombs, no fuel, no support. We have 12 airplanes that work until they don't." He paused, waiting for someone to laugh or protest. Nobody did. "If anyone has a better idea than flying these things until the wings fall off, now's the time." Nobody had a better idea. That night, Marine mechanics worked by flashlight, siphoning every drop of aviation fuel from abandoned Japanese trucks, pumping it through parachute silk to filter out debris, and hand-pouring it into the dauntless fuel tanks using salvaged Japanese jerry cans. It took 7 hours to fuel 12 airplanes. They scrounged enough fuel for 38 minutes of flight time per aircraft. Enough for one mission. Maybe. The 100-pound practice bombs were another problem. The dauntless bomb racks were designed for 100-pound bombs. The practice bombs were too small. They'd slip through the release mechanisms and possibly tumble into the propeller arc during release. One mechanic, Sergeant Victor Magakian from Fresno, California, spent 3 hours bending metal straps from packing crates into makeshift bomb shackles, using a ball-peen hammer and a tree stump as an anvil. At 11:30 p.m., a coast watcher on Bougainville Island radioed Henderson Field, 29 ships heading your way, speed 12 knots, distance 210 miles. Japanese troop transports escorted by destroyers, heading for Guadalcanal to reinforce Japanese positions and push the Marines off Henderson Field. They'd arrive by noon the next day. Mangrum calculated fuel, distance, time. The Japanese convoy would pass within 60 miles of Henderson at approximately 1:00 p.m. the next day. His Dauntlesses could fly 60 miles, drop their improvised bombs, and have maybe 7 minutes of fuel to get back to Henderson before running dry. The math was brutal, and the logic was simple. Attack or let the Japanese land 4:00 reinforcements unopposed. At dawn on August 21, 1942, Mangrum led 11 Dauntless dive bombers off Henderson Field. One aircraft stayed behind with a failed engine. The runway was so short that the Dauntlesses barely cleared the coconut trees at the far end. They flew north at 500 feet, skimming over the jungle canopy to stay below Japanese radar, Mangrum navigating by compass and guesswork because Henderson had no maps of the area. At 12:47 p.m., Mangrum spotted the Japanese convoy, 4 transports, 3 destroyers, steaming in formation through the slot between New Georgia and Santa Isabel Islands. The destroyers saw the Dauntlesses immediately and opened fire with their anti-aircraft guns. Black puffs of flak appeared around the formation. The transports began zigzagging, increasing speed, turning hard to starboard in coordinated evasive maneuvers. Mangrum didn't hesitate. He pushed over into a 70-degree dive toward the lead transport, the 600-ton Kinryu Maru, and released his practice bomb at 1,500 feet. The bomb hit the transport amidships, penetrated the thin deck plating, and exploded in a cargo hold filled with ammunition crates. The explosion wasn't as dramatic as a proper 100-pound bomb, but it was enough. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship. Fires started. The Kinru Maru slowed and began listing to port. Behind Mangram, 10 more Dauntlesses dove on the convoy. They scored 4 more hits with practice bombs, 2 on transports, 2 on destroyers. Not enough explosive power to sink the ships outright, but enough to wreck equipment, start fires, wound crew members, and force the convoy to slow down and break formation. The Japanese convoy commander, Captain Yasushi Watanabe, radioed back to Rabaul. Under air attack by enemy dive bombers, 2 transports damaged, continuing toward objective. But Watanabe was lying. The convoy wasn't continuing. It was turning around. The Kinru Maru was taking on water. The destroyer Mutsuki was burning. And there was no air cover. The Japanese Zeros, based at Rabaul, were 560 miles away, too far to provide escort. Mangram's formation flew back to Henderson Field on fumes. 3 Dauntlesses ran out of fuel and crash-landed in the jungle 2 miles from the runway. The pilots walked back through knee-deep mud and made it to Henderson by nightfall. No injuries, no deaths, airplanes destroyed, but pilots saved. That night, a B-17 flying out of Espiritu Santo spotted the Japanese convoy withdrawing north at high speed, abandoning the mission to reinforce Guadalcanal. The practice bombs hadn't sunk any ships, but they'd accomplished something more important. They'd convinced the Japanese that American air power at Henderson Field was operational, effective, and aggressive. The Japanese postponed all future daylight reinforcement attempts and switched to nighttime runs, using fast destroyers instead of slow transports, a tactic that reduced their capacity from 4,000 troops per run to 900 troops per run. Over the next 6 weeks, Henderson Field became the most important 600 feet of coral in the Pacific. Dauntless dive bombers flew 167 combat sorties from Henderson between August 21 and October 3, 1942. They operated with minimal fuel, improvised bombs, hand-scavenged spare parts, and flight schedules dictated by whatever the coast watchers radioed in. Pilots flew 3 or 4 missions per day until they collapsed from heat exhaustion. Mechanics worked around the clock, keeping aircraft operational with parts cannibalized from crashed Japanese planes, improvised tools made from scrap metal, and repair manuals rewritten by hand because the official manuals had been lost when the transport ships evacuated. The Dauntless proved something at Guadalcanal that it hadn't proven at Midway. It could operate from terrible conditions with almost no support and still accomplish the mission. The airplane Heinemann had designed to be light enough to survive carrier operations turned out to be light enough to operate from a jungle airstrip with battle damage, low fuel, and makeshift repairs. The simplicity that Navy brass had criticized in 1940 became the airplane's greatest asset in 1942. By October 1942, the Japanese had lost 23 destroyers, 9 transports, and 4 cruisers to air attacks around Guadalcanal, most of them to SBD Dauntless dive bombers operating from Henderson Field. The Japanese High Command quietly abandoned their attempt to retake Henderson and began planning a defensive withdrawal from the Solomon Islands. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it the Rat Run. Either way, they were retreating. Heinemann heard about Guadalcanal from a Douglas aircraft liaison officer who visited Henderson Field in September 1942 to assess combat damage and interview pilots about aircraft performance. The officer returned to El Segundo with 8 pages of handwritten notes, mostly complaints: insufficient armor, underpowered engine, inadequate defensive armament, uncomfortable seats, poor cockpit visibility. Heinemann read the report twice, then filed it. He didn't make any changes to the Dauntless design, not because he was stubborn or arrogant, but because he understood something the pilots didn't. The Dauntless worked precisely because it lacked those things: More armor meant more weight. More weight meant shorter range, slower climb, weaker dive performance. The pilots wanted a better airplane. Heinemann had given them the right airplane. Major Richard Mangrum survived the war and returned to Seattle, where he worked as a commercial pilot for United Airlines until his retirement in 1968. He flew Boeing 727s on domestic routes, wore a pressed uniform every day, and never talked about Guadalcanal with passengers or crew. When people asked about his military service, he'd say, "I was in the Marines," and changed the subject. Mangrum died in 1985 at age 72 from a heart attack while mowing his lawn on a Sunday morning in June. His obituary in the Seattle Times mentioned his 30-year career with United Airlines and his service as a Marine Corps pilot during World War II. It didn't mention Henderson Field, the practice bombs, or the fact that his improvised air attacks in August 1942 had prevented the Japanese from retaking Guadalcanal and possibly changed the entire course of the Pacific Campaign. Sergeant Victor Magakian, the mechanic who bent packing crates into bomb shackles using a hammer and tree stump, survived Guadalcanal, fought at Bougainville and Okinawa, and returned to Fresno after the war. He opened a small machine shop on Blackstone Avenue, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and worked 6 days a week for 43 years repairing farm equipment, automobile transmissions, and industrial machinery. He retired in 1988 at age 67 and spent his retirement restoring antique tractors. Magakian never applied for any medals or commendations for his work at Henderson Field. When a local newspaper reporter interviewed him in 1992 for a story about Guadalcanal veterans, Magakian shrugged and said, "I fixed airplanes. That's what mechanics do." The reporter asked if he'd ever felt like his work was important, like he'd contributed something meaningful to the war. Magakian thought about it for a moment, then said, "The airplanes flew, the pilots came back. That was the job." Victor Magakian died in 2003 at age 82, surrounded by family in a hospital in Fresno. His obituary mentioned his machine shop, his 4 children, his passion for antique tractors. It didn't mention that the improvised bomb shackles he built in August 1942 had kept 12 dive bombers operational for 6 weeks, enabling 167 combat sorties that helped secure Guadalcanal and turn the tide of the Pacific War. In 2015, a Navy historian named John Lundstrom published a comprehensive study of air operations at Guadalcanal based on declassified combat reports and interviews with surviving pilots. The study documented every sortie, every bomb hit, every aircraft loss. The appendix included a section on field modifications and improvised equipment, which mentioned Magakian's bomb shackles in 2 sentences. Sergeant V. Magakian fabricated improvised shackles for 100-pound ordnance using salvaged materials. These modifications allowed SBD aircraft to conduct dive bombing missions during the critical period of August 20th September 15th, 1942. 2 sentences, for work that helped save Guadalcanal. Heinemann read Lundstrom's study in early 2016. No, wait. Heinemann died in 1991. He never saw the study. He never knew that his airplane had operated successfully from Henderson Field. He never knew about the practice bombs or the improvised repairs or the 167 sorties flown on salvaged fuel. He designed the airplane, delivered it to the Navy, and spent the rest of his career working on other projects while the Dauntless went out and proved again and again that simplicity and lightweight could accomplish what complexity and heavy armor could not. The SBD Dauntless flew its last combat mission on July 5, 1945, during operations off Okinawa. By then, the Navy had fully transitioned to the SB-2C Helldiver, which had finally been debugged enough to be safe and effective. The Dauntless was officially obsolete. After the war, the surviving Dauntless bombers were either scrapped for aluminum, sold to foreign air forces, or dumped in the ocean to make room on carrier decks for newer aircraft. Today, exactly 13 airworthy SBD Dauntless dive bombers remain in existence worldwide. They appear at air shows occasionally, flying in formation, their perforated dive brakes creating that distinctive shriek. Old men stand in the crowd and cry, remembering. The rest, all 923 of them, are gone, melted down, sunk, scattered across Pacific islands and ocean floors, lost to history except in photographs, combat reports, and the memories of men who flew them and trusted them and came home alive because Ed Heinemann had once decided that every single pound mattered. If this story moved you, if you're grateful that someone finally told Ed Heinemann's story the way it deserved to be told, hit that like button. This channel exists to rescue these forgotten heroes from history's margins, but we can't do it without you. Subscribe so you never miss another story of quiet genius and impossible courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Do you have a connection to aviation, to the military, to World War II? We've heard from viewers whose grandfathers flew Dauntlesses, from Navy veterans who maintained them, from engineers who were inspired by Heinemann's work. Your stories matter. Share them below. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. Thank you for making sure that the men and women who won this war, not with headlines and medals, but with slide rules and midnight shifts and unshakable conviction, are finally recognized for what they built and what they saved.